Okay, so here we are, moving on to part 2 of lesson 3, and now we're going to talk about Aesop's fables. So you've probably heard of Aesop's fables before. You maybe even read some or had some read to you by your parents or a teacher when you were a kid. So we're going to talk about these fables, where they come from, why they were important in the ancient world, and how they're culturally relevant today beyond being just moral stories for kids. Hopefully you found them to be a quick read. As I mentioned at the start of the last part of the lecture, we're using an approach where we read a longer text, like a Gilgamesh or the Bible or the Iliad or the Odyssey, and then pair that with a shorter text like some poetry, or in this case, these really short fables that span just a few pages in our textbook. So hopefully the reading was quick and enjoyable for you, because I know the Iliad, part 1 of this lecture, is quite a challenging read. So hopefully these were quick and enjoyable. But without further ado, let's get to them. So a little bit of background on the fables. As I said, people today think of them as children's literature, but in the ancient world, the Greco-Roman world, meaning the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire, they were very popular, especially among adults. But impressions change over the centuries, and literary works have legacies. And so how we as a culture and a society treat a piece of literature today might be different from how the society from which it came from treated it. And so I think because these are short, they have talking animals, and they teach a moral, people have assumed they're for children. I mean, those are a lot of the characteristics of a Disney movie. I could have just been talking about a Disney movie. So I think in the 21st century, some of the qualities we associate with literature or media that's for children, Aesop's fables possess those. But in the ancient world, when they first were written, adults loved them too. And so I think that right there shows there's something of value here worth studying. And part of our goal with the lesson is to pull on that thread and find out exactly what these tales have to offer us today as adults. Because people often treat them as mainly for children today, they're not part of what we would call the literary canon. Now, if you're not familiar with that term canon, with one N rather than two, like a cannonball, what the canon is a group of texts that scholars over the years have decided these are the most important texts. These are the ones people should be studying. And the idea of the canon has been around as long as universities in the U.S. and England with literary studies programs and English departments have been around. So, a little over 150 years. And so scholars for a long time have been saying these are the most important works. These are the ones we need to study. And those works make up the canon. And so works like the Iliad, the Odyssey, Gilgamesh, the Hebrew Bible, those have always been a part of the canon, pretty much from its beginnings. But in the last 20 to 30 years, people have started to push back and say, what is the criteria for determining if a text fits in the canon or not? Should we potentially revise these criteria? Maybe there are some really important works that we should really be reading that people have so far left out of the canon. And because of when the canon first became an idea about 150 years ago, a lot of the early discussions of what should be in the canon were conducted mainly by white upper-class males, because those were the people 150 years ago who were able to go to college and get a degree. And as people have had that opportunity, as the ability to get a college education has broadened out to more genders, more races, more social classes, people have started to question, at least some of the motives of placing things in the canon. And so Aesop's fables, because in the more recent decades have been treated as children's literature, they weren't part of the canon. But because the canon is undergoing revision and people are asking what should be in the canon or not, that's all the more reason why we should read Aesop's fables. The Greeks, fully grown adult Greeks thought these tales, these fables are really valuable. We should read them. And so, scholars today are saying, well, think about that a minute. Maybe Aesop's fables should be in the canon. So this is one example of what we call non-canonical literature. And more in the 21st century, universities are offering classes that teach non-canonical literature. And I think that's a good thing. I think there's a lot of literature out there, a lot of popular literature that has a lot to tell us. It's popular because it speaks to people, even if it doesn't speak to the traditional kind of academics who, for a long time, were the ones picking out what goes in the canon. For instance, I like to teach classes with comic books and graphic novels, and they haven't been part of the canon before, but they're very popular and they tell us a lot about our culture and our society, so they should be studied. And I think you can make kind of a similar argument for Aesop's fables. So that's why we're studying the fables and a little bit of why they're relevant and important. Let's take a little bit more of a look at kind of the history surrounding them. There's not in a biography, you could say, that we would normally look at for an author. Because most of the texts in this class are so old, if we were studying Charles Dickens or someone from the last couple hundred years, we'd go through a lot of biography right now. But we don't even actually know if Aesop was a real person. These fables started to show up as people would tell them out loud in ancient Greek society. And at some point, the Greeks were like, we need to give a name to the originator of these legends. And so they gave him the name Aesop, but no one really knows who he was or if he even actually lived, this person called Aesop. So for that reason, the biography is not important. A lot of kind of facts have circulated about the person who was potentially named Aesop. A lot of people thought he was a former slave, and after escaping slavery, these tales were kind of his response, but there's no real way to verify or prove that. But almost all of the biographical details we have about Aesop, we can't really prove any of them, but all of them that we do have depict him as a lowly, down-to-earth, unpretentious, and fun person. So his personality would seem to match kind of the style and the tone of the fables. And so that just makes sense, and we don't really know anything about him, and so the biography is not really that important. So we'll talk about the tales themselves more so then. And they were stories based on a long oral and written tradition and come from a variety of sources. So kind of like with the Iliad, people were saying them out loud for enjoyment and entertainment in ancient Greek society. And eventually there were enough of them, and they'd been told long enough that people kind of pinned this down as a genre, naming it fables and coming up with a name for an author, even though that author probably was not a real person, and people just kind of started telling the tales. And so they come from a variety of sources, perhaps not just from ancient Greece, because in these tales you can see links with Egypt, India, the Near East, and other cultures. And our footnotes in our book tell you which fables also show up in works from these other cultures. Further evidence of this is that the fables even include references to animals that were not native to Greece. For instance, like the camel, the elephant, and the dung beetle. And we already know that Greek and Roman cultures were heavily influenced by those of their neighbors. Back then, we didn't have the same kind of currency we have now, and so trade was really important. And the Mediterranean is this body of water that connects, southern Europe, where Greece is located, to northern Africa, and even on the east end of it, parts of the Near East. And so, people would sail from Greece to other countries. They'd get together, they would trade goods, and they would tell stories out loud. And so, maybe some guy from some other country told a story with a camel to a Greek sailor, and when he got home, he started telling that story, and it just kind of became included. in Aesop's fables. This is really how literature circulated in the ancient world, and that's kind of why you have like a flood story in both Gilgamesh and the Hebrew Bible, is this trading and talking amongst one another. So people didn't just trade goods, they also traded stories. And this leads us to our last fact here, that Aesop's fables were not produced by a single author at a single point in time. And so in this sense, they're very similar, or more similar to Gilgamesh in terms of their history than the Iliad. With the Iliad, you had not one single author at one single point in time in terms of the bigger legend, but you did have Homer, who eventually wrote the legend down and gave his spin on it. And Gilgamesh is something similar, except we don't know the name of the person who finally wrote down the one complete version. So the fables are really unique then, that we can't pinpoint one author at one point in time. And so this is just kind of some history, some context, so you have this in mind as we go in and we study the fables. So let's review the reading questions real quickly before we go farther. One question I have is, have you heard any of these fables before? I heard them when I was a kid in school. I think my parents even told me some of them. We might have had a little Aesop's Fables book when I was a kid. And so what are your impressions of them before reading them for this class? My goal with this question was to maybe have you jot down some things before you read them, and then after you read them, you could kind of compare those observations to your post-reading observations. In today's world, people mostly think of Aesop's fables as stories for children. I already mentioned that. So why do you think they were popular for adults back in ancient Greek society when people were first telling them out loud to each other? I think what this question really gets at is our most important question we ask, which is, why are these stories or these writings valuable or significant? What can we learn from them? And so we'll come back to that bigger question at the very end of this lecture, but I think this question is a good way into it, kind of a first level toward answering that bigger question. Just thinking about, if we think that for kids today, and that's partly because our values and things have changed, what about them was appealing to adults then? That might help us to see what's worthwhile about these texts. Okay, so in terms of doing a close reading and going through the text, I'm just going to pick 4 fables, kind of put forth an idea, and then share a quote that matches up to that specific fable. So compared to something like the Iliad, which is a very, complex and long, but also cohesive text, these have some common themes, but they lack cohesion. So the order of the discussion points here will seem fairly random. I've tried to identify concepts or ideas that are present throughout multiple fables and just use kind of one example to illustrate that. But it's not like when we look at a text with a narrative, like Gilgamesh or the Iliad or Jacob's story, where the ideas kind of develop as we go. This is more kind of like a random list of themes you see throughout multiple works. And I've tried to come up with discussion board questions that will allow you to do something similar. In other words, these are the interesting things I've observed. I want to hear the interesting things you've observed later on. So I think the first fable, the Medes and the Athenians, is really interesting because it kind of is self-reflective in a way and illustrates the importance of the fables and of narrative in general. So you have this teacher, this scholar, who's lecturing to young students, and they're not paying attention. So he says, when he failed to get their attention, he asked if he might tell them an Aesop's fable. The audience agreed, so Demades began his story. And then he kind of tricks the students by not giving them the moral of the story, so robbing them of everyone's favorite part, the ending. But The reason why this is interesting is he's giving a lecture and everyone's bored. And then when he decides to tell them a fable, everyone's ready to listen. And so this shows how they were popular and entertaining in ancient Greek society. And I think it gestures to a bigger idea that really has to do with one of the core themes for this class, which is, to put it simply, that people love stories. A narrative will draw people in. They want to find out what's going to happen. That's kind of how I introduced this class at the start of the first lecture. When I said, do you watch Netflix? Well, we're going to look at, the things that were treated in ancient society as the way we treat Netflix today, as entertainment, but that have endured for millennia, and that shows they're perhaps worth studying. That whole question about canon, you could kind of ask a question of, what from Netflix or Amazon Prime that you watch today will be around in 500, 1,000 years. We can learn a lot about a culture by studying what's popular at the time, but studying what endures after that time tells us both about the culture and ourselves. And so works like the Iliad and Gilgamesh have endured, but Aesop's fables have endured, even if they're not thought of as highly by most scholars. And so this quote here in this first fable gestures to the idea of the popularity of narrative, that everyone loves a good narrative. And when you have enduring canonical literature with really good narratives, you can learn more about yourself and more about the world around you by reading those. Okay, so moving right along. Another thing that comes to mind is stereotypes of animal behaviors, because these are really old texts, just like everything else we're reading. Some of the first things ever written or heard of in the ancient world. And today we have certain characterizations with animals, right? Donkeys are lazy. Oxes are hard workers. Foxes are crafty. But animals, do they really have these personality traits? Owls are wise, for instance. We think of animals that way. They're kind of stereotypes that persist in our culture, but they're animals, right? We kind of know some about their instinctual behavior from biology, but do they really have these personality traits? Are foxes really cunning? Are owls really wise? Or is that something we ascribe to them when we're kind of anthropomorphizing them or making them seem like prescribing some human traits to them for the purposes of stories like these fables or Disney movies? So that's a question. And then the other question that goes with that is, where do these come from? Who is the first person to call a fox cunning or an owl wise? And I think it might have been in Aesop's fables, because these are really old. And so if you look at these stories, since the majority of them have animals, you see a lot of characteristics that we ascribe to animals today when we depict them with human-like qualities in literature. And so I'm just throwing out the idea, maybe Aesop's Fables was the first place some of them showed up. And you see lots of examples, but I've just picked one for this bullet point, and that's the fox and the raven story, where the fox, being cunning, tricks the raven. And he wants what's in the raven's mouth. And so he says, "Oh, raven, the elegant proportions of your body are remarkable, and you have a complexion that is worthy of the king of the birds. If only you had a voice to match, then you would be first among fowls." So he's like flattering the raven, kind of puffing him up. And the raven, of course, speaks, so he drops the morsel of food in his mouth that the fox wants. And so the fox wins. The moral is don't trust certain individuals, which the fox here represents, because he's crafty and cunning. And so, this teaches us a lot about flattery and to really be careful. Think about what people say. Spend some time interpreting everything you hear. Don't just take it all for granted. And we get, of course, the stereotype about the fox that I already mentioned. But, interesting thing about ravens, they're beautiful birds if you see one up close. And the fox describes the raven accurately here, even though he's trying to butter him up. But ravens are one of the few speaking birds. You've probably heard of parrots and how they speak. And you might know that ravens also can be trained to learn words and say them. Um, Edgar Allan Poe's poem The Raven features that, but it's a real thing. Ravens can do that. And so the fact that the fox here is emphasizing the raven's voice stands out. Maybe some of these stereotypes kind of come from the animals themselves. Maybe someone observed a raven talking and chose a raven as opposed to any other bird they could have chosen for this particular story, because I don't think the type of bird matters that much here until you think about the raven's voice. And so, not to kind of keep throwing out more bird metaphors, but it's kind of a chicken and an egg kind of question. Which came first, the animal or the thing associated with it? And I think that's just kind of an important thing to think about as we think about human-animal relations. And Aesop's Fables gives us a new angle or an interesting take on that. So the fables are most known for these morals they give us, but do they offer anything else? As the introduction to the textbook points out, not all of them have as their main goal communicating a moral. And so what are some of the other things besides morals that some of them communicate? For this question, I'm going to use the story of the dung beetle and the eagle, for example. And this is the story where a hare, like a rabbit, is hiding from an eagle that wants to eat it, and it takes refuge in the dung beetle's home. The dung beetle says, "No, I've given asylum to this hare, don't eat it." And the eagle eats it anyway, which is a huge violation of the codes of hospitality that were incredibly important in ancient Greek culture, which we'll see when we study the Odyssey in the next lecture. The Odyssey has hospitality as one of its very important, most central themes. And hospitality was very important to the ancient Greeks because of the relationship to the gods that you've already seen reading the Iliad. And so if someone, a stranger, showed up at your house and you didn't know who this person was, they could be a god in disguise. And so if you were rude to that person and it turned out to be a god, the gods would punish you. So you had to be nice to strangers. Today we don't let strangers into our home because it could be dangerous. It certainly was dangerous in ancient Greece as well, but it was even more dangerous to not be kind to a god. And you never knew if the stranger was a god or not. At least that's what the Greeks believed. And you see that actually in the Odyssey, the next thing we're reading, when Athena pretends to be a person and shows up at Odysseus' house. And so the dung beetle has given hospitality to the hare, and the eagle violates that very important Greek custom by still eating the hare. And so the dung beetle brings the case to Zeus, and the dung beetle keeps destroying the eagle's eggs. He's so outraged by this. Hospitality was that important to the ancient Greeks that the dung beetle wants to wipe out all eagles, like get rid of them forever. So he keeps destroying the eagle's eggs to prevent reproduction, to prevent the growing of and birth of more eagles. And so the dung beetle brings that question to Zeus, but Zeus did not want the race of eagles to be wiped out, so he urged the beetle to relent. When his efforts to persuade the beetle failed, Zeus changed the breeding season of the eagles so that it would take place at a time when the beetles were not found above ground. And so you do have a very clear moral here about hospitality that I just explained, but you also have an origin story. This fable also explains the origin of the breeding season of eagles. And when people think about mythology, legends, folklore, that's often what they look for those types of texts to do, is to explain the origin of something. And so the fables function in that capacity. And it's interesting because when scholars think of ancient Greece, they think of the epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. They think of the tragic plays we'll read later in the quarter, and they think of the mythology. They don't typically canonize the fables, like I've already said, but this kind of a story almost elevates the fables to being closer to mythology. They're at least serving a function beyond a didactic moral, more to the level of something mythology does. And so I think some of these fables do go deeper than just a very obvious moral, especially the last couple, which are a little bit longer in the prose when you read them. And so I'll be very curious to see what you have to say on the discussion board about the potential complexity of some of these fables. And that's why I'm not discussing all of them. I'm kind of leaving some of them for you to write on. You can write on any of them. You don't have to, and actually I encourage you to write on ones other than the ones I'm talking about in this lecture. So we'll take a look at one more before we go to our discussion board questions. And so this one has to do with the idea that these are very relatable, that you and I as ordinary people can perhaps relate to the characters in these fables. And so I ask, have you ever met anyone like these characters? And I have, for example, from the dog in the manger, the cows say to the dog, "You are being very unfair by begrudging us something we need, which is useless to you. Dogs don't eat hay, but you won't let us near it." Have you ever met someone like this? Someone who, if they can't enjoy something, tries to spoil it for someone else? I used to work for a guy, my old boss was just like that, and it could be kind of frustrating sometimes. And so I think whoever wrote these, and it was a variety of people, but I think some of the authors were just ordinary people who took their ordinary everyday experiences and turned them into these kind of moral stories, and people really enjoyed them because they could relate to them. And so my question to you is, can you relate to them? Can you enjoy them today? Or are these customs and values more resonant and more relevant to the Greeks? Or are there things that stand the test of time? Because if we're answering the question of should these be part of the literary canon, I think they have to endure in popularity beyond their own time. And so I'm asking you, what from them resonates with you today in 2020? Okay, discussion board questions. One thing I noticed when reading that seemed important is that for the most part, the fables recommend a consistent set of values. So, how would you describe this set of values in your own words? In other words, even though they're all these individual stories by all these different authors, I see some kind of similar values, some patterns still emerge. So I'm asking, what are those patterns? What are maybe some values that span multiple stories? And then articulate those in your own words. Two, on the other hand, because they are by multiple authors from multiple periods of time, even though there's a fair amount, a good deal of consistency, there's obviously clearly some contradictions too. Even if there's more consistency than contradiction, the contradictions are also still very important. So do you see any fables here with morals that contradict each other? And if so, what is significant or interesting? What kind of stands out about these contradictions? My next question has to do with the idea that the fables resonate with us or are relevant today. I ask, while the Greek epics such as the Iliad and the Odyssey were about upper-class characters like kings, queens, and generals, and aimed at upper-class audiences, Aesop's fables were about lowly characters, some not even human, and intended for ordinary readers like you and me. Do any of the characters or their stories or values particularly resonate with you, and why? So, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Gilgamesh, Hebrew Bible, Jacob's story, those things are appealing to us because they're very universal. We can relate to Achilles and his struggles, even if he's a huge jerk, and we want to see his character growth. But it was very much a story at the time for the upper class, whereas these fables were, like I said, by the everyman, for the everyman. And that's why they weren't part of the canon, at least partially. A reason why, because, like I said, initially the canon was formed by white male upper class men. And so, the fact that these are more for the everyman and present a more kind of eminently relatable opinion than a more esoteric idea, they weren't initially part of the canon. But maybe there's something you really see here. Maybe there's something you really connect with. And I'd love to hear what that is. And along those lines, my last question, this question can kind of help answer the last question. My last question is the one we've had all along that I think is the most important question. Most scholars do not believe that Aesop's fables have as important a place in the literary canon as works like the Iliad and the Odyssey do. Do you think Aesop's fables belong in the canon? Why or why not? And if so, what of significance or value do they offer to readers today? Hopefully I've given you enough background on the canon in this lesson that you can answer this question if you want to. And if you do, I would say if you're answering this question, the best criterion for determining if they should be in the canon is, do they endure? Do they transcend? Is their appeal mostly to the Greco-Roman world, or do they have something to offer us today? And if they do, then it's probably yes. And so that's the way questions 3 and 4 are related. But again, you always just have to only pick one question to answer it. And I'm really looking forward to reading your thoughts.